Okay, now we're connected. All right, I'll let folks into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator here. And tonight we're hosting the launch of The Look of the Book by Peter Mendelssohn and David J. Alworth. You can buy copies of the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page and I'll repost it here. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and they'll take questions at the end of the event. And let me introduce our speakers now. David J. Alworth has taught literature, history, and media studies at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. He teaches and writes about modern and contemporary literature, media, art, and design. He is the author of Sight Reading, Fiction, Art, Social Form, and his essays have appeared in Public Books and the Los Angeles Review of Books, as well as in various scholarly journals. Peter Mendelsohn is the former art director at Alfred A. Knopf, the creative director of The Atlantic, and the author of a design monograph published by Powerhouse Books called Cover, as well as What We See When We Read, which has been translated into 14 languages, and the novel Same Same. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Paris Review, and other magazines. And I'll hand it over now.
Do we not get to see anybody? Do they only see us?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh man, that is extremely weird. I had no idea.
Hello,
so
everyone.
David, like, this is so strange. We're gonna have to remember that this is public and not private because I'm gonna forget.
Well, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's bad to not see everybody else.
It is.
Can I make a suggestion? Which is that not knowing how many people are actually in this thing, that maybe because we're going to sort of freeform it, if people want to ask questions, do we need a dedicated Q&A or should we just let people ask questions as they want?
Rolling questions. That sounds good.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. So where should we start? Do you want to start with the origin myth?
Sure. So how do we meet? Peter, I met you, really, I heard you on the radio. That's how it started. I was making oatmeal on Tuesday morning, I think, Wednesday morning, some weekday morning. And I heard an interview that you were doing, I think it was on Terry Gross, and you were talking about what we see when we read. And I had just finished thinking in a piece of my scholarship about the question of interaction between verbal and visual art. And you were speaking about this in a way that really interested me. And I listened and I thought, I'd like to know that person. So then I reached out and we got connected, and it seemed it didn't take very long for us to become pretty good friends. I mean, we started talking about Ulysses and Moby Dick, and we had a lot of interest in common when it comes to literature and philosophy, right? I'm remembering this correctly, that we started thinking about philosophy.
It's not in your bio, but you had studied philosophy as a graduate student, right?
Yeah, my graduate studies were pretty theoretical and philosophical. So we started, and you were a philosophy major in college. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. It occurs to me I have no idea what your graduate work in philosophy was on. Was it analytic or continental or?
So I was in the English department, but I went to the University of Chicago where the boundaries between disciplines are pretty permeable. And I was able to take courses in philosophy and critical theory and media studies. In any case, we ended up finding that we had all these interests in common. And I thought you'd be great to come visit one of my classes. So I asked you and you graciously agreed. And I had no idea what we would do, but I thought maybe we could design an assignment for the students who were studying modernist literature. Maybe we could design an assignment for them to redesign book covers of canonical novels.
Was that first class, was that Gravity's Rainbow?
Yeah, so that class, that was the second class.
Okay.
But that class was great also. So, you know, how do you design a cover for Gravity's Rainbow, right? We invited undergraduates to redesign a cover for that novel. And, you know, for those of you who've read it, you know, it's very long, it's encyclopedic, it's somewhat unruly, it's really formally complicated. So figuring out how to do a cover for that was not an easy task, but the students were game to try. And
David,
you
have I
helped
told you that I've now seen Thomas Pynchon in the flesh twice in my life?
twice. That's
Yeah.
2 more times than most people. What are those moments?
I was having a drink with a friend of mine. This would have been last summer, I think. Maybe it was the fall. We were having a drink on the Upper West Side in the 80s. And he's a book editor. And we were having this literary conversation about whatever. And we walk outside, and there's this old dude sort of shuffling towards us who's like sort of incredibly thin face, big glasses, a kind of white shock of hair, cane. And this is a person who knows everybody. He just leans over to me and he's like, "That's Thomas Pynchon." To which I replied, "No, it's not." And he's like, "I'm pretty sure it is." So we stood there like idiots staring at him as he walked by us. And then I went home and I Googled that, whatever the British tabloid was that ended up taking that picture of him when he was picking his kid up at school. And it was him. And then this same editor and I had a drink maybe 2 months after that at the same bar. And as we were leaving, the same old man was shuffling towards us.
Yeah.
And I was just like, there he is again. And the amazing thing is, like, if you've read any Pynchon, the paranoiac mind is his sort of great subject. And the idea that we were being stalked in this particular spot, like Slothrop and the V Rockets or something, it was absolutely amazing.
Well, maybe he's watching our webinar now.
Yeah. See, this is the danger of not being able to see an audience, is that I'm going to go off on these crazy tangents and there's nobody to stop us doing that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yes, the second class was Gravity's Rainbow, which I remember was great. Like, the kids were super interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the subject of that class was sort of visual signifiers in Gravity's Rainbow. And I remember speaking a lot about the kinds of visual metaphors that he uses. And the great thing about Harvard was that a lot of those extremely bright kids in an English class were also like pre-med and taking organic chemistry, and they were able to bring all of these other disciplines to the table, which is perfect for reading an encyclopedic novel. And I remember just being totally blown away by your students. And at the end, they designed something.
Yeah, and the best part, I feel like what inspired us, or at least what really inspired me, was that they were allowed to make digital images, but they decided to, by and large, maybe 8 out of 10 of them decided to make analog images, to cut with scissors, paste with paste, to design by hand. And that's what got us thinking about the book cover as a physical object that's undergoing some pressure in the context of digital transformation, but that isn't simply going away. People do cherish physical books and still think about book covers as physical things. So I wonder, maybe
wait,
since
before you leave that topic,
go ahead.
It occurred to me that maybe that the transition from the sort of the meat space to the digital space that we've been experiencing over the last decade and a half has even intensified during the pandemic. You know, we were talking before, and you were teaching a Zoom class, and you know, I'm the creative director of the Atlantic, and so I'm on Zoom all day long. And you know, it just occurs to me when you say that I think more than ever since the pandemic, I am drawn towards the artifact, the physical book, specifically because of this, the thing we're doing right now.
Yeah.
That so much of our lives were already mediated by screens, but now it feels like close to 100%.
Yeah.
Do you have that same feeling?
Yeah, same feeling. In some ways, I'm like everyone, you know, I wish this pandemic were over, but in some ways it's a context that makes the physicality of the physical book even more palpable than it would have been. And we really hope that people who have a chance to have our book in their lives can experience it as a physical thing, who can feel the embossing of the cover, who can leaf through the pages, and who can see that the physical design really does interact with some of the arguments we're trying to make in text. That was something that I think we both really wanted to achieve, that there would be this interplay between the visual and the physical on the one hand, and the verbal and the conceptual on the other.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I now have this, I've been reading Proust, as some of you in the audience know. You would think
it's more like living with Proust, right? I mean,
yeah.
You're kind of carrying it around, and it's
my
part
life
of your
is suffused by
day.
Proust right now.
Yeah.
But I'm, you would think that it would be the perfect book to read on a digital device. A, because it is so freaking heavy, but B, because there's so much that you have to keep track of in terms of indexing the characters and the places and all of that. And, there's a public domain, the Moncrief translation exists in the public domain, so it's very easy to get an ebook of it, which I actually have on my device. And I just can't bring myself to not read the physical book. I mean, for one thing, like I'm taking so many notes in it, and there just isn't a comparably good mechanism in the digisphere to do something like that. It's just made me very much appreciate the tangible object in that case.
Yeah, the codex, right? The paged book. It's a great technology. It still works.
Yeah, it really freaking works.
Yeah.
And speaking of Proust, I had this passage that I wanted to read to you, David, as a prompt. It's like the most pretentious thing in the world that I'm reading Proust right now. It's Sarah's fault, who's on this call, supposedly, faceless.
Hi, Sarah.
So there's, who's also in the book. In Place Names, the Name, which is the chapter at the end of Swann's Way, Proust is talking about names of places and names of people, signifiers. It's sort of the pre-structuralist Saussure. And it's a really brilliant chapter. And there was one line that I read that I thought was one of the better descriptions of actually what a book cover does. And it's not about book covers, it's about the names of places. So here's the passage, the prompt. He's talking about place names. Names present a confused image of towns which they accustom us to believe are individual, unique, like people, an image which derives from them from the brightness or darkness of their tone, the color with which it is painted uniformly like one of those posters entirely blue or entirely red, in which, because of the limitations of the process used, or by the whim of the designer, not only the sky and the sea are blue and red, but the boats, the church, the people in the streets. Because the name of Parma, one of the towns I had most wanted to visit since I had read La Chartreuse, seemed to me compact, smooth, mauve, and soft. And if anyone mentioned a certain house in Parma in which I would be staying, he gave me the pleasure of thinking I would be living in a house that was smooth, compact, mauve, and soft. And so what he's saying there is that the literal two-color printing process of maps, specifically the kind of maps he says are in the sort of pedagogical posters you see in classrooms, in French classrooms at that time. Or else the kind of fold-out maps, which were pretty new at that particular moment. Because of the way that they were printed, they imprinted upon that signifier and indelibly changed the way you would think of a place or a person, is sort of his point. But what interests me about that is the stickiness of the signifier as a kind of framing device, the way it's sort of magnetic and kind of accrues all of this sense data to it. So that when he thinks of Parma, he thinks of mauve, which is also interesting because, like, end of the Second Empire, beginning of the Third Republic, like mauve had just been invented. It was like the decade of mauve. So it was like, it was like the hot Pantone color of the decade. But so that meant that when he thought of these towns, he would think of them suffused by that particular tint. And in a way, I read that and I thought, oh, David's going to freaking love this, because in a way, that is exactly what a book cover does.
Mm. Mm. Fascinating. So I guess I hadn't really thought about the direction that you're talking about, where you see a cover and then it colors your perception of the text, partly because I was so interested in how a text, which is not a very rich medium when you think about it, it's black marks on a page that stimulates imaginative thinking, but it's not especially sensuous. I was interested in how the text gives rise to visual iconography, which was really one of the questions that motivated this book project. So you're sort of inverting it. You're saying, okay, the cover primes your expectations for how to see, or better, it colors how you will see, right? To follow up on your mauve description, it colors how you will see what the writer or the author has presented to you. But what's really interesting to me as a critic and a scholar of this material is to think with you about how you are able to pull out certain visual symbols, or what you often call signifiers, from the text. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about how that works? I mean, I know we've talked about this extensively, but is there something that really illustrates for you? Is there an example from your experience that really illustrates for you something general about how a book designer might get this 100,000 word manuscript and figure out, okay, how do I turn this into a visual image that's going to somehow carry the metaphoric weight of the whole project?
Hmm. I mean, I guess the answer to that question is, I mean, I've had varying levels of success with doing that over the last 20 years. My feeling is, in reference to that Proust quote, on the one hand, on the one hand, I think like you're absolved on some level from doing your job, because whatever you put on the cover of this book will work like mauve on a map for Proust. It will color the experience. It will frame it. If you're vague enough with the kinds of signifiers that you deploy, then I think you have a very good chance of, escaping the wrath of the writer or scholar or close reader. And however, I think if you're a deep reader and you're at all attuned to the sort of phenomenology of what it's like to read and the kinds of images that occur to you as a reader when you're engaged in the process of reading specifically fiction, then it really behooves you to think very deeply about what the manuscript is trying to accomplish. And I think, there's really two important rules, I think, in terms of making a cover that's successful and that represents the manuscript. The first really applies to making sure that you adequately represent sort of the book's gestalt. Like, forget about the individual characters or the mise en scène or whatever it is, that you want to sort of represent the project as a whole. And then the other thing is to make sure that you don't over-represent. And I've talked about this a lot, just this idea of not sort of, we in the book, there's a lot of discussion about the idea of mediation and the way in which a cover mediates a reading experience. I'm most comfortable when I'm doing the least amount of mediation. Like I would really like to not put too many ideas in the reader's head, while knowing that whatever I do, whatever color choice or typographic choice I make is going to influence in a very subtle way the way in which that world building is going to be done in the reader's imagination.
So can I just interrupt you? Because this is the opposite of being absolved.
Right. No, it's contradictory. That is my point. Yes.
Right. Okay. So I preempted you, but this is why cover design is so interesting to me. So the first reason I became captivated by this project was because of the people. I thought to myself, wow, there are all these people who are doing all this labor, which is a big part of contemporary book culture. they need to be part of the critical and scholarly conversation. What they're doing is literally making books, right? So that was question one. Who are these designers? What are they up to? How are they framing and packaging and visualizing the texts that we think of as contemporary literature? But the second was, what is at stake for the person in your position who is tasked with a pretty big task? You're determining how a book is going to look for the world. You're determining how that author's manuscript, which she may have spent years laboring over, you're determining how that's going to look for everyone to see. So it doesn't seem like you're absolved. It seems like you're immensely responsible for something.
Well, here's the other side of the equation, the absolved side of the equation. So I just, I've written a couple works of fiction. I have just had the experience recently of writing a novel and having someone other than myself provide a cover for it. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a real elucidating experience. I mean, the interesting part of it was that even for me, I mean, I know I don't really, post Roland Barthes, I don't really exist or matter qua authorship, but you would think on some level that in terms of like imagining the world of the book I created, that I would be sort of like ground zero, right? I should have some great idea about what my book is, feels like, looks like, sounds like, et cetera, et cetera. When the cover showed up, at first I was like really resistant. And then it took like 5 minutes before I just, something in me just sort of shifted again, like Mauve and Parma, where I just all of a sudden was like, oh yeah, this is the world of my book. And you just realize how malleable and somewhat amorphous these, I mean, that is the great thing about imaginary worlds, right? Is they're extremely personal and adaptable, and so is the human mind. So even I, who had some degree of, well, actual authorship, and I also sort of learned what I've heard the wiser authors that I've worked with say, which is that you really should butt out of your own cover designing process, that, often the writer is just too close to the material to have any sense of what it is, and you should really leave it to a third party. So that actually made me feel much better about all of those times that, I fucked up my job, or, I didn't do the best job on a cover, or I thought I had failed the author, or the pressure was too immense, or, because I think, again, like vis-a-vis Mauve, and that's the last time I'm going to say the word Mauve, that was the last time.
Yeah.
I think you really, unless you do something that's like patently offensive, you can't really screw it up too badly. But that isn't to say that there aren't really truly great covers that get everything right. And there are examples of that, I think, where the cover is really deeply informed by the text, and then some added, and then the cover, the sort of the paratext then adds dimension to the reading experience.
Right. So when I was trying to figure all this out, when I was thinking about the cover design process in particular, I was thinking, okay, so there are at least 3 different sources of authority, or sites of authority, or authority figures, right, that the cover designer has to manage. The first is, let's call it the artistic or aesthetic authority of the manuscript itself. You can't misrepresent the manuscript. I mean, you can, right? We have lots of examples of covers that do, but you probably shouldn't. You probably want to be accurate to the text, to the manuscript, right? So that's authority.
At the very least, to the diegetic facts of the manuscript.
Yeah, right. So probably, well, I'll let people, if they have a chance to read the book, see that we have some examples of total misrepresentation, right? So that's like authority figure number 1. Authority figure number 2 would be the publisher, right? The publisher is selling a commodity, and this is a marketing document. This is a designed to package a commodity and get it sold. So you have a commercial imperative, right? So an artistic or aesthetic imperative and a commercial imperative. But then there's also this third imperative or source of authority, which is really interesting to me, which is designers designing for other designers, right? It's how you all are in this subspace of literary activity where you're making designs for literary fiction and looking at each other's work and thinking about each other's work and taking inspiration from each other's work. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that, about the community of designers that have inspired you, that you've been in dialogue with, and how you think about, really, how do you think about other designers when you're designing a manuscript?
I mean, book cover design is such a niche occupation. And I mean, it's a great job, but it's a very it's a very odd job in that it's symbiotic with this other kind of art form, as you mentioned, these other forms of authority, the most important one being the author, the manuscript. And there are so many rules to what you can do and can't do in this rectangle, this 6x9 rectangle. I think often you find with all of these vectors pushing on you, like marketing and publicity and the author's wishes and the author's butler's wishes and the author's sister's butler's wishes,
Right.
you know, and the editor-in-chief, and you know, there's so many, you know, and branding genre, which is obviously a big part of it too. Like you have to, there are certain kinds of tropes that you're going to have to deploy to make something look like what it is, so it's recognizable as that particular genre, which is something I really don't like doing. But you're so like there's a lot of creativity that's crowded out, like just from the start.
Yeah.
And so
I'm
you have
thinking
to sort
about
of
that,
find your
that one
joys.
moment. I forget who it was, but we had one interview where the experience of getting the cover approved, that final approval meeting is a little like a therapy session, right?
Yeah,
This idea that everybody is sort of like, okay, expressing their feelings and
yeah,
getting
it's
their
completely nuts. Publishing is batshit. And it's not a science at all. And the interesting thing is that everybody wants to be able to, you know, push the dial in terms of the success of the book. And there's so few ways to do that, you know, everybody is just like jumping over one another to try to affect the way the cover works and looks, because that's one of the things that evidently affects the way a book is received. So I guess my point is just that you're very hemmed in from the get-go. From the jump, you're just like, there's not that much I can really do here. So where do you find sort of like inspiration and gumption to do something that's, you know, where do you find the excitement in it? And I think, you know, my experience in those years in which I was an in-house designer, you are sort of challenged by your peers, other designers, to think of interesting and new ways to explore that rectangle and find ways to get around, like loopholes, to get around the rules, whether they're rules about genre signification or how big the typography has to be, or I think there's like an inherent kind of rebelliousness because designers are sort of like subalterns in the publishing hierarchy, because they're so like just above the mailroom and below editorial assistantship. Like there's this feeling that you're just beneath the underdog, so you want to sort of bend the rules a little bit. So I think there's this whole language that book designers speak to one another, which is about how to subvert those rules. And I mean, there's an interesting sort of fall-on effect from that, which I think is beneficial, which is that good designers who really are paying attention to how to bend those rules are making covers that are sui generis. They're making covers that have not been seen before. By virtue of that, they aren't camouflaged when they come out like amongst like. They are, for better or for worse, new. And my you know, my philosophy of design and marketing has always been to really lean on this idea of making something that is as unlike everything in the space as humanly possible. And that's how you tautologically stand out, is through difference. So, you know, there is that nice fall-on effect from the fact that designers are speaking to one another. I mean, the downside is that a lot of the preoccupations of book designers, I think, have to do with, are deeply informed by like the zeitgeist, you know, like what happens to be cool at that moment. And there are lots of these kinds of tropes that you see at any given moment that you just know are going to age really, really badly. There was this whole moment I remembered right when I started in the sort of mid-ish 2000s where designers were, we didn't talk about this in the book, but it's kind of an interesting thing, where there was like 5 to 10 years where designers would just design something and then they would scan a piece of like old paper or parchment and throw it behind whatever they designed as a background, which instantly, like, you know, like a deckled edge, you know what that is? The
Sure.
rough edges, the rough fronts of a book are supposed to mimic like the cut pages of a, you know, a 19th century novel or whatever.
Annoyingly impossible to turn the pages. You have to turn them, you have to hope that the top is not deckled so you can turn from the top.
Yes. I'm trying to see if I have an example. I do actually. Look, 2 Prousts. This is a deckled edge, rough front, and this is a smooth front. And this sucks, but it is a signifier, right? It's supposed to, sorry, it's supposed to tell people that what they're reading.
A classic. It's a classic.
It's classy. It's got an imprimatur to it. But so in the same way, designers would sort of use like this parchment, this faux parchment thing. And if you look at books from that period, you can't help but see all of this fake parchment, and it is deeply annoying to me now. But, you know, in the same way, like we went through a 10-year period where most of the copy, like title and author name on a novel, had to be like scrawled out by hand just because somebody did that, and then all of a sudden it was interesting. And, you know, for that period, like novels were just like, there wasn't a lot of typesetting anymore. Who knows why? And those are the kinds of things that I actually do find deeply annoying. And the perverse side of me, I mean, not that I design book covers anymore, but if I were to be designing book covers now, I would just sort of look at whatever those trends are, and then I would just like race in the opposite direction. I guess that was sort of my methodology when I was doing it as well.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the problem really is eventually, no matter what kind of designer you are, eventually your work is going to be like put in an anthology like ours, and you're going to look at it and you're going to see all those sort of time-dependent tropes, those like faddish things that don't age well, and you're going to punch yourself in the face because it just feels really sucky.
Yeah. Well, sorry for you. But for those of us who are historically minded and looking back at book covers, this is what makes them really interesting as evidence for a historical argument, right? Because there are elements of a book cover that are timely in the sense that they respond directly to their historical circumstances, but then elements that are timeless, that in some sense transcend that moment, if it's a good book cover, right? We speak a lot about book covers that have withstood the test of time or whatever. And that's really fascinating when you go back and you can use the book cover as a medium that brings together not only multiple people, right? The author, the marketer, the agent, the blurb writer, the designer, but also it brings together culture and commerce, right? It's kind of right on this cusp between culture, whatever we think that is, and commerce, whatever the workings of the economy. It's sort of right in between. It's in that liminal space, or that in-between space between those two domains.
Yes.
I wonder if you ever think about that. So when
I do, and actually it's germane to this idea of fake parchment. You know, I mean,
right.
It becomes part of the historical record in a very interesting way. And when you think of that parchment, like if you think of UX design, for instance, at that moment, if you think what Apple was doing at that moment, it's like the great skeuomorphic era, right?
Yeah.
Everything was skeuomorphism, like this idea that we would borrow something from the real world and we would recreate a simulacrum of it in the digital space, and that'll make us all feel way more at home. And in fact, like when you look at those parchment covers, what they are is a product of an anxiety, like a cultural anxiety about, you know, where is this alternative space going to lead us as a species, and how do we ground ourselves in light of it? And, you know, and the joke was the way that we ground ourselves is not by creating like fake real things. You know, it's not by hyper reality or, you know, this kind of like procession of the simulacra stuff. It's through actually returning to, you know, the real world, the meat space, the palpable, tangible stuff that is hard to talk about on a Zoom call, but you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Because you can feel it and smell it and taste it.
Right. Right. Well, part of what you're talking about is the way that technology interacts with human experience, right? And to think about the book cover is also, in some expanded sense, to think about the relationship between humans and technology. Because, and we talk a bit about this, right? So there's a moment in the book where you can really see how cover design trends are influenced directly by new technologies of design. So maybe you could talk a little about that, because your career extended long enough that you kind of lived through a digital or computing revolution as a designer. So
Yeah.
start from year one and then take us to year 25, right? So how
Right.
did technology impact your design practices over that 2-decade period?
Well, the people who hired me for my first job were people who designed covers, making physical mechanicals. They would cut things out and draw things and tape them together and cut out the typeface and glue it to a surface and have that photographed. And it was a very craft-based discipline. And at the moment that I entered, it was a little after the first wave of the desktop publishing revolution, and everybody was using Quarkxpress, which is a piece of layout software, which was incredibly rudimentary. And the thing about Quark was it allowed you to do this exciting thing where you could create a box and then you could put a picture in it, and you could create a box and you could put typography in it, and you could change out the typeface and you could change out the photograph or illustration. And basically that particular piece of software, by virtue of how it was built, the interface and what its capabilities were, encouraged designers to make covers that were pictures in boxes, and then type above or below those pictures in boxes, also in boxes. So there was this long period of time where design, the tool necessitated a certain kind of design. And then came Adobe and InDesign and Photoshop. And when Photoshop first hit, you had this glut of covers that had these very cheesy photo effects, drop shadows, and lens flares, and that was also not particularly great. But as the software got better, ironically, what happened is, and counterintuitively, is that in fact, good designers started to recognize that there was a way to distinguish yourself from the kind of demotic design that was being done for the mass market, and that was to start doing things by hand again. So, pretty early on in my career, I found myself not so much a designer as an illustrator. And, I was, like I said, there was that period where all the type was hand done. But also, like, a lot of the covers that I was doing, I made entirely by hand. Like, I would either shoot the photographs or I would make the illustration, or all of the above. And that was really the fun for me in it, was the idea of the aspect of craft I thought was really interesting and engaging. And I think we all looked down our noses at people that weren't engaged in that same way, who were still putting stock photos in boxes. So, I find it sort of perennially interesting how the tools define the product. And I don't think you tell me, has the great scholarly book on Microsoft Word and literature been written yet, as opposed to Scrivener or longhand?
So
one wonders.
There's an amazing body of scholarship on the history of the book and on media studies, which thinks about books as media objects, which I would be happy to refer any of our viewers and listeners to. I have bibliographies I could share. I'd be happy to share them. I don't know if we're getting any questions, but if we're getting questions, happy to answer them, including that question, directly with an extensive bibliography.
It is such a weird panoptic experience. Like, we could be on the Mir space station, and have no idea if the missive we're sending out is
floating,
actually
right?
reaching
Doing
actual human
somersaults.
beings.
So I guess part of what you're saying about this relationship between technology and human craft, it's really interesting and I think really relevant to our moment today where so much of culture is being driven by technological capacities and constraints. I guess I'm interested in those covers that, for whatever reason, in whatever moment of technological history, function as a kind of literary criticism, meaning they do some work to help us interpret the text.
Mhm.
And that's actually kind of fascinating, right? When you stop and think about it. So we think of literary criticism as writing about writing. But what happens when it's a visual image that's doing that kind of work? Is there something from maybe your own archive that you think of as, okay, this is a book cover that really helped me see the text in a way that I otherwise would not have been able to see it?
I'm dying to answer the Rupi Kaur question that just popped into the questions. I have a suspicion I know who just asked it. So the answer to that question is, listen, like when I worked at Knopf, a lot of the manuscripts that I worked on were really good. It was a great publishing house to work for. And, you know, I really invested a lot of time and energy in reading those manuscripts. And I like to think that a lot of the covers that I did during that time, whether they were for Knopf or freelance, that they are works of interpretation, greater or lesser. But the act of designing something that really changed the way I thought, there was one example of the act of designing that really did, in fact, sorry, I have a chat and a Q&A.
Yeah, they're now streaming in. I think we've figured out our own relationship to this technology now.
Yes, exactly. The job that I think was the most formative for me was the Kafka job. Just in the sense of, they're not necessarily the designs I'm most proud of, but the thing that I am proud of is that I think just by virtue, simply by virtue of using bright colors in that redesign, that it recontextualizes Kafka's work for an American reading audience, in the sense that, you know, when I read Kafka in high school and in college, you know, the extant sort of covers for those books were all really, really dark, like not just in terms of affect, but in terms of the color space and the colorways. Like they were, and for sure, there's a lot of pessimism in Kafka. There's a lot else in Kafka that I think has been neglected. And I think, you know, most readers who come into contact with his work, if what they're being presented with is like a sort of, you know, a series, like a kind of like fascist symbology, or a kind of like overwhelming bureaucratic symbology, that you're going to approach that work in a very, very particular way. And just to give it a framing that I think was a little more yay-saying and allowed a little more air into the room and allowed people to see that the project is humanist, that the project can be funny. Those I think are, like that particular job, I think was the one in which I really saw for the first time that what you put on the front of one of these things actually really makes a difference. And weirdly, you know, it was the project I worked on that had the biggest, like literally got more feedback instantly on that than anything I've done since. And I mean, and I'm including a lot of bestsellers. Like that was just a project where it seemed like there was a massive cohort of people who really loved this particular writer and felt like he had been misrepresented. And you know, in terms of authorities, you know, you listed 3. The only one I would add to that is the authority of the reader, who has to live with this thing. And, you know, that the decisions that you make, the aesthetic decisions that you make, are driven to some extent by like mercantile realities, but they're also driven by this sense that you want to make something that has some lasting some lasting value, and is the kind of thing that you could imagine a reader would enjoy having for the rest of their lives sitting on their bookshelf, and could survive multiple rereads of a particular text. And so I take that authority also pretty seriously as a reader myself. Like, there are lots of books that I own, texts that I really love, covers that I really hate. And, I just rip the cover off and it's fine. Sorry, I just wanted to address some of these things that were in the Q&A.
Sure. So can you pause for a moment just so I can say the thing about reading? Because I just want to follow up on your point about reading.
Yes.
Part of what you're advocating for, it sounds to me, is this expanded notion of reading, right? That reading isn't just I don't know what people think reading is, but why shouldn't it include looking and handling and being in the presence of books that you're remembering, right? Isn't reading a kind of amorphous, complicated activity that involves a whole range of different sensorial experiences, right? So one of the questions that really came up for me, and this is partly inspired by thinking alongside book historians and media theorists who think about these questions all the time. I'm thinking of Deirdre Lynch, for instance, who we quote in our book, who's an eminent book historian. These are the sorts of questions that are about what reading is, right? And what do you have to think that reading is in order to think that visualizing a manuscript, right? Turning a text into a visual image. What do you have to think reading is to think that that is giving a reading, right? Giving an interpretation. And I think intuitively we know that good book covers give a good reading of the text at hand, right? Whereas bad book covers, however you want to think about bad, they're misreadings. They're readings that we want to reject, that we oppose, that we take to be cliche or wrong-headed or uninformed, right? So this idea of reading seems to me really important, even though you could get into the technical experience of designing and talk all about the different ways in which, say, Quark or InDesign or whatever your software is going to affect your practice. Ultimately, what you're doing is you're giving a reading and translating what you've encountered into a visual representation.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting and absolutely right. And I think framed in that way, it is really the best possible job somebody could have. If only there weren't all of those other vectors pushing on you. I'm gonna hit these two in the Q&A, and then David, you should hit the one in the chat.
Sure.
So Rupi Kaur, is this Arsh from The Atlantic asking this question? It has to be. If it is, say so in the Q&A, because you work for me and you have to tell me. I felt confused because I didn't know. The question is, what do you think about the shout out you got from Rupi Kaur in New York Magazine? Rupi Kaur is an Instagram poet. I didn't make up that terminology. It is what I think she calls herself. I was confused because I didn't know who she was. And it wasn't until somebody explained it to me that I understood her vast popularity. The second question is favorite book covers and books I would want to redesign. Oh, favorite book covers is a perennially tough one for me. David, what are your favorite book covers? I know, it's a tough one, right?
Yeah. So I avoid that question, and I also avoid the question in the chat. The question in the chat is asking me to predict the future, which I'm bad at, and I'm also not great at listing favorite book covers. Although I can talk about some recent redesigns. They're not. This is sort of dodging your question, but it's not a bad way, I think, of dodging it. So I had the experience of sharing our book with some friends who are book collectors and booksellers, like people who are real experts in rare books. And the Moby Dick cover that you and Oliver did for Apple Books really struck them as, can I share it? Do you mind?
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll share it. This Moby Dick cover, I think, captures something really powerful about that novel. And actually, there are several of them that are worth considering.
While you're looking for that, I'm going to answer the books
Sure.
you would want to redesign question.
Yes.
I have a very short list that just got slightly longer because I'm reading Proust. And I don't think there is a great Proust cover. Almost entirely convinced that there isn't. I mean, this is pretty good. This is what the French did, and I like it, but it doesn't really say much. Oh, right.
This one.
Yes.
So maybe could you talk a little bit about this one? And then I'll talk a little bit about the novel, but I'm interested in how you approach this cover.
We could talk about Moby Dick and covers in general. Let me just tie off this one question.
Sure. Sorry
so
about
Proust, I've always wanted to do a Pynchon novel of any kind, and now that he's hovering around me, clearly the signs are pointing towards something someday. Virginia Woolf, I've never done a cover for Virginia Woolf. I would love to do a Dalloway or a Lighthouse. That would be super fun. Overrated famous book covers. I mean, The Great Gatsby, I don't know, maybe Dave and I'll have to go to war over this one, but I think the Great Gatsby cover is formally beautiful, has become indelibly associated with the book in our minds, but I always found very confusing, honestly. Haunting. I always sort of thought when I was a kid, I remember seeing the paperback on my parents' shelf and thinking, what is this book about Las Vegas? Because it's got all these neon lights. And it took me a long time to figure out that it wasn't about Las Vegas. I just find it very confusing.
But what's fascinating about that cover, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I have to. So because I've been editing this edition of The Great Gatsby for the last 2 years and thinking a lot about that. But what's really interesting to me about Gatsby's cover is that there is some evidence in the historical record that F. Scott Fitzgerald was inspired by the sketches that Francis Cugat created for The Great Gatsby. And
that is incredible.
That caused him to shape some images in that text. It's not perfectly conclusive. There's some scholarly debate about this, but I believe it. I believe that those eyes helped to inform the way that Fitzgerald wrote his novels. So for me, that's a great example of interaction and collaboration between cover designer and author. So for that reason alone, I think it's an interesting cover. I agree with you.
There's no question that it's interesting. And I didn't know that. And that's really fascinating. And I love, as I know you love, also hearing these stories about when the arrow works both ways between cover and text. I've had just a handful of experiences of that in my life, and it's always extremely gratifying. But I want you to address this question about the institutional space and the idea of image text medium.
Yeah, so this comes from Claire, and so thank you for your question. Claire asks if, so Claire writes, there isn't really an obvious institutional space for those interested in this image text medium, certainly considered cross-disciplinary, which is true, it is, somewhere between graphic design and literary arts. And Claire asks, do you anticipate new areas of study to emerge as we become more and more image literate? I hope so. I hope if not necessarily new areas emerge, but more capacity is built for students to work in media studies, broadly construed. I was basically trained in media studies in graduate school, and this question actually comes from Claire identifies herself as a University of Chicago alum, so maybe Claire studied in some of the same courses that I taught or studied in myself. I hope that media studies becomes an even bigger field. I think we need to train students to think about relations between verbal and visual art, and to think about technology and how technology is affecting culture, and to also, of course, think about all the big ethical, political, and social questions that have to do with massive technological change. We're living through a revolution right now, the digital revolution, which is complicated, obviously, and its outcome is uncertain. So my hope, in response to Claire, is that more and more students are trained to be specialists in thinking about intermedia relationships and the big social and political questions that emerge at the interface of technology and culture.
Are there any other questions? I realize we're closing in on 8 o'clock. This is probably the last gasp if anybody has any questions. Anything, doesn't matter how nerdy or wonky, happy to.
While we wait, can we go back to Moby Dick?
Oh, yeah, Moby Dick. Moby Dick is an interesting case, I think, because, you know, without speaking specifically to the Apple Books job, which was, you know, that's an interesting job just by virtue of the platform that it's on. But speaking to Moby Dick as a text, I think, has there ever been a richer, more capacious, terrifyingly encyclopedic novel to have to make a cover for? I mean, in that case, like the diegetic aspects of the text are really easy to use, and we all know what they are, and that's why there are whales and harpoons and seascapes on the cover of every Moby Dick you've ever seen. Of course, that's not the novel's deeper project, which is hard to describe, but it has something to do with the Godhead and the numinous and, you know, negation and...
Well, there's Ahab's famous soliloquy, right, where he speaks about going to the lower layer. I always hear it in that, for some reason in my mind, I hear it in my mind's ear, I hear lower layer. So
well, what's funny is that, you know, I was thinking about, like, there is one or two comps in the book Moby Dick covers where I specifically reference the Ahab speech and the idea of the doubloon, the reward for essentially killing God, which is what's being proffered. You know, I think it is, it's too obvious to say that it's a misreading to think that this is a book about whaling, because, and it's not even really a misreading, it's really a book about a lot of things, one of which is whaling, which provides a kind of shaggy armature for a book about deep epistemological and ontological questions. And, you know, it's interesting that your friends came to the Apple Books cover, because in a way that's the one that's the most kind of descriptive. Like, it has an Ishmael on it, and albeit an Ishmael that's sort of broken up into pieces, and is really like in this age of hybridity, part man, part whale, which I don't think in a way is a very necessarily a good reading of the book, because really whale and man, in my reading at least, are being set up oppositionally. You know, if the whale is everything that's sort of, you know, like is the silent heaven, or the negation of what's knowable, or you know, that in fact there is no intersection between man and whale, that the whale is just everything that isn't, you know, that it has to be defined sort of like Maimonides is God in terms of a negative, and can't be defined in terms of a positive. So, you know, the covers that I really loved for Moby Dick, which I've never, other than the Apple thing, I've never worked on any Moby Dick that has been produced commercially. Like, the ones that I really loved were the ones that did sort of entertain that idea of, you know, sort of, I mean, to call it a black hole, it's obviously a white hole, but like, you know, Moby Dick is, in a way, that's what he is. He's a breach of the space-time continuum. She, I don't know. So, I mean, that would be, like, if I were ever asked to produce a commercial Moby Dick jacket, I would really just have to cordon off like 12 months of my life. I would have to like go to a monastery. I would have to spend a lot of time in deep thought. I might have to find a crow's nest that I could hang out on. It's a really
well, you could go to Western Massachusetts in the winter, right? And you could live in a farmhouse, and
right.
write it.
Bedford is actually really kind of crappy. And, obviously Provincetown does not look the same as it did in Melville's day either. But it would be a really good brief. And I mean, in a way, the most interesting book jackets, I think, are the ones for books that are trying to contend with those things that are hard to put into words.
Yeah.
And those, I think, are the books that I'm most drawn to as a reader, but I'm also most drawn to as a designer, because it gives you a particularly special challenge. And I think that's why Proust would be interesting also, is that, you have all this Belle Epoque stuff, and that's the easy thing. But if the deeper part of the project is, a man engaged with trying to understand how we apprehend the world, how we preserve it, and how we interpret it intentionally and unintentionally, then that's a great brief. It's really hard, and I have no idea how I would do it, but I would be very interested in doing it. So
I think we're out of time. There's one
Yes.
last question. It's not really it's sort of a question. It's just human skin binding versus Le Corbusier's dog hair binding. And maybe we just end on that books have been bound in all sorts of fascinating ways, and the materials that people have used to bind their sheets have been various. So one example is human skin, but another, maybe you could just end on the story that we tell in the book of Le Corbusier's dog and how he created a binding for that.
That's the end of the story. His favorite dog, his beloved dog, died, and he, preserved its skin and then wrapped Don Quixote was his favorite book. So his cover of Don Quixote was, it's just sort of doubly insulting. It's insulting to Cervantes, and it's insulting to the memory of his dog. Le Corbusier was not a particularly nice man.
But it's an interesting
the question
object.
is, which would you prefer having in your house? I would definitely, I would prefer having a dog skin in my house to a human skin, just because, I don't know. I think that is a good and grotesque way to end.
It's almost Halloween, right? So it's appropriate.
Yeah, grody. If there are no other questions, does Powerhouse have to end this, or do we end this?
I'll come back in. Thank you. This is super fun and interesting for anybody who's curious about books. Thank you so much to Peter and David, and to everybody who asked questions. A lot of good questions. And if anybody missed any event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Look at the book. All right. Bye.